I'm going to talk about criminalising nuclear war. I'm going to talk about the concept of criminalisation and its origin. And I'm going to particularly consider whether it's possible, or how it might be possible, to sanction organisations that were engaged in developing systems that led to nuclear war. Now, first of all, I should say right from the beginning that there is a difference between nuclear war and previous wars, and this difference is qualitative, not quantitative. It's quite clear to me, having looked at what has happened in the last 50 years, that as a result of the problems associated with developing radiation risk models, something which I've already talked about, and because of the problem of the current radiation risk model, that the American generals and perhaps also the Soviet Russian generals and whoever advocates the first use of a nuclear strike or the possibility of winning a nuclear war has no real understanding of the difference between nuclear war and other kinds of war. What they think is that it's just bigger. So in other words, in the Second World War it was possible to destroy a city with high explosive. We know that Hiroshima and Nagasaki were destroyed by atomic weapons. But also Hamburg in Germany and Dresden in Germany were destroyed by a particular pattern of bombing using high explosive and incendiary weapons, which destroyed those cities and completely flattened them in what are now called firestorms. So these firestorms sucked in oxygen, or they used up oxygen, in such a way that people who were not even affected by the heat suffocated due to lack of air. So these were enormously large incendiary events. But and the generals now believe that nuclear war will be basically more of the same, more of that. So you can destroy Moscow, you can destroy New York, but after it's all been destroyed, somebody will have won the war in some sense, and business will return to normal after all the bits and pieces have been put back together, just as they've been put back together in Berlin and in Hamburg and in Dresden. And these are all cities that are now functioning. But they're wrong. And the reason is because radiation destroys the genetic damage, the genetic structure of all living systems. And so what we're talking about if there's a nuclear war is not genocide, which would be like the destruction of a large number of people, which is a development from homicide, which is, if you like, the destruction of one person, the murder of one person. It would be planeticide, if I can coin the term, and I'd like you to try and write that down and think about it. It's a new concept, right? It's called planeticide. And the only place that you will find the concept of planeticide or something similar to it will be in science fiction stories, where some new mega weapon is developed by some alien organization, some alien evil empire, if you like something out of the film Alien, which destroys a whole planet. You can see this done in Star Trek, for example. But make no mistake, nuclear war, if it ever occurs on any sort of scale on this planet, will have the same effect in terms of the destruction of all living systems. So we want to start there and make it quite clear that this is what we're talking about. We're talking about criminalising a system which would result in the destruction of the planet. So let me go back to the idea of criminalising war. Some years ago I was invited to Malaysia by the ex-Prime Minister Tun Mahathir Mohamad, who ran or set up and now still runs an organisation called the Perdana Peace Foundation. And the interesting concept developed by Tun Mahathir was to criminalise war, because as he said to me, it's illegal to kill somebody in time of peace. You can't go out there with a gun and shoot somebody. If you do, you will get arrested and locked up, or sent to jail for life. In some societies you will be hanged or killed in some way. So it's against the law. But in the war, all you have to do is some country, some nation, some structure decides to write down that it's declared war against another nation or structure, and then you have a carte blanche to kill anybody you like. You're sent off to battle with a gun or a set of missiles or an aeroplane with bombs inside it, and you can kill people, and nobody sends you to jail. But why? How can that be different? It's the same phenomenon. You kill somebody, you've taken a human life. In one case you go to jail, in the other case you get a medal. You get a medal. Isn't that extraordinary? Well, it was an extraordinary idea, a very bold idea to criminalise war, and I think it's necessary, of course, as he did, especially with the world running out of resources and the economic system gone mad, and all of the things that we've talked about earlier in this conference. So we are on an arrow towards some kind of war, and the kind of war we're on an arrow towards is nuclear war. So I need to go back to the beginning then, if we're going to talk about criminalising anything. We need to ask ourselves whether the whole concept of making laws of this type and criminalising systems or criminalising activities has any sort of origin in basic morality. For example, I mean, you can watch cats playing with mice, and you could say, well, this is awful, the way in which they play with mice, you know. And if there were a cat society, you might wonder how it were that there might be a law that prevented cats from being cruel to mice. Of course, there isn't, and cats continue to be cruel to mice, and human beings who imagine themselves to be the cat or imagine themselves to be the mouse say, oh my goodness me, isn't that awful, the way that cat is just playing with that mouse, and it doesn't even want to eat it, it's just throwing it up in the air and torturing it and so forth. So this immediately brings me to the idea of how laws are essentially part of the societies that generate them. So then you might ask yourself, how is it possible to have a law as widely ranging as a law that criminalises nuclear war? Well, we start with where laws come from. Now, there are three examples that I want to briefly talk about relating to the concept of deciding whether something is illegal or wrong or morally reprehensible, something that we would wish to outlaw in our system of society, or in fact on the planet. And these are universal laws, if you like. And one of the best example, or the best, or the earliest elucidation, the earliest example of somebody talking about how it can be that these laws are intrinsic in some sense, that they're generated from nature. You can say they're sort of natural laws, if you like, certainly as applied to humans, was the idea of Immanuel Kant, the German philosopher, who wrote an awful lot of stuff which is extremely complicated and quite hard to decode, and many people have written about Kant's philosophy. But the most important aspect of what it was he said is this: that you do not want somebody, because that you do not, you have a system of morals based on the idea that you don't want somebody to do something to you. Rather, you don't want to have a system where you can do something to somebody else that you wouldn't want them to do to you. It's really a very simple idea. And the reason, so the difference between the cat and the mouse situation and the human situation here is that the cat cannot think, or at least we assume that it cannot think, what it would be like to be a mouse. So when the cat kills the mouse, or plays with it, or tortures it, it doesn't in its mind think, oh my goodness me, what if I was that mouse? How would I like to be treated like this by a cat? It doesn't think that. But you see, human beings can think that because we have much more complicated and clever brains. So we can play out in our minds little thought experiments. We can imagine what it would be like to be the other person. Well, you all know that. You all know that you can see what it would be like to be the other person. And what Kant said essentially was that you didn't want to have somebody do something to you that if you imagined you were the other person that they were doing it to, would occur. In 1890, an English author, I think he was a vicar, called Charles Kingsley, wrote a book called The Water Babies, which was essentially a children's story which related the ideas of Kant. And so it's probably easier to understand what I'm talking about to talk about the water babies. In the water babies, what happens is that there's a little boy who's been very badly treated. He's a chimney sweep, and he dies in the story. He apparently dies, and ends up under the water with a lot of water babies. These are just, like, if you like, little fairies that live under the water, and they have all sorts of adventures and so forth. But this is a tremendously and rather sinister moral story, which is quite frightening if you read it. And the two goddesses, if you like to call them that, or the two individuals that regulated the behaviour of the water babies were called, and there were two women, and they were called Mrs. Do As You Would Be Done By. That was the first one. And the second one was called Mrs. Be Done By As You Did. So I'll say this again so that you've got it. Mrs. Do As You Would Be Done By, and Mrs. Be Done By As You Did.
Maybe you should explain them.
I'm going to explain them, right. So Mrs. Do As You Would Be Done By, what she does is she tells the children, the babies, and Tom, the chimney sweep boy, that your source of moral behaviour, your source, wellspring of your action towards other people, is to do to them as you would like them to do to you. This is pure Immanuel Kant. So, in other words, if you would like them to be nice to you, you're nice to them. If you want them not to hurt you, then you don't hurt them. So you act towards them as you would wish them to act towards you. And what Kant said, and what Kingsley elucidates in this story, is that this is the source, the origin, and the wellspring of human morality. And it should be universal, according to Kant. It should be universal. Because you cannot imagine any system where you wouldn't want the people to do to you as you would do to them. And then, of course, there's a sanction. And the sanction is the other woman, Mrs. Be Done By As You Did. So in other words, in this case, if you're nasty to somebody, then Mrs. Be Done By As You Did will ensure that somebody is equally nasty to you. In other words, to show you, if you like, to cause you harm in the same way as you cause the harm to the other person. So this is a rather simplistic but more easy to understand version of Kant's writings on the source of moral, source of ethical behaviour. And more recently, in considering the concept of a just society, an American philosopher called John Rawls has developed the concept of the veil of ignorance. Now, what this means, what he says is that in order to create the best society or the best system structure, what you do is you have to imagine that you are going to appear when you're born. You're going to be in that structure at some point in the structure. So you could be in charge, or you could be a chimney sweep. You could be, I don't know, a prostitute, or you could be a criminal. But what you want to do is, your idea is to develop the structure of the society in such a way that whichever situation you end up in is best for you. And this deals with the idea that, of course, unlike the water babies where everybody is equal, in most societies you have situations where there's extreme inequality. So you have very rich people and you have very poor people, and we know that that's the case in the world today. In all societies, or most societies, you have a wide difference between the people who are rich and powerful and the people who are very poor. So what Rawls says is that you should consider this veil of ignorance, which tells you that you cannot know what position that you will end up in, and you try to design a society that is best for you. So that's essentially the basis of all natural ethical structures. It of course suffers from slight problems associated with the fact that different societies have different ways of seeing the world. And as the anthropologists have pointed out, you can have societies where people are all essentially really quite nasty, or you can have societies where people are essentially quite nice, or you can have societies where they were quite nice and they become nasty, like Sweden, or like the Nordic countries. Because we all know, I mean, and people say how great the Nordic countries are, and in fact they were at one time quite good to all of their citizens, but this is no longer the case now, because they are controlled by banks and by money and by economic structures. So I'm going to fast forward to now to these days, to the current situation. The current situation is one in which you have two quite distinct sets of behaviour, or not sets of behaviour, but you have systems of laws or systems of belief which are written and enshrined in various doctrines, and you have the actual way in which people behave, and they're really quite different. So you have systems and individuals and systems of individuals, and you have human rights constitutions which are written by and enshrined in most legal structures in the world. I mean, you will go to for example, the United Nations Declaration of Human Rights, and you can apply these human rights, if you like, in your mind, to all sorts of situations which have occurred in the world since the Declaration of Human Rights. And you can say, but hang on a minute, none of these people who have carried out what we would call criminal actions, which are sort of contrary to all of these declarations of human rights, have been sanctioned. Nobody has been sanctioned. Nobody has gone to any of the international courts and taken these people to task. There have been lots. I mean, I won't go through I won't even start to go through all of the examples of this. I mean, we all know what they are. We all know what they are. But they all basically have to do with the behaviour of one group of people against another group of people, and this is particularly clear in times of war. And this has resulted in a sort of application of human rights arguments to war, which has resulted in the concept of war crimes. So, for example, the use of chemical weapons in the First World War was considered to be a war crime, and there had been various signatories to agreements to outlaw, to ban chemical weapons. And you have to say, well, why? You know, because if you have a war between this country and the other country, and they want to win the war, clearly this is what war is about, then why can't they use chemical weapons? What's wrong with chemical weapons? And actually that's a very good question. Nothing is wrong with chemical weapons. They're just another way of killing people. So to go back to Tun Mahathir, what you ought to say is that what's wrong with weapons at all when you're using them in sort of some overall sense where one country attacks another country. But anyway, something about the way in which these chemical weapons works has made the whole idea of it very upsetting to human beings. So when they apply this sort of Kantian concept, this water babies concept, to the use of chemical weapons, they can see themselves coughing their guts out. They can see huge blisters on their faces from chlorine or from phosgene. They've heard the stories about the men who came back from the trenches in the First World War who were gassed with chlorine. And they're horrified. They're horrified by the way in which this happens. It just seems to them sort of intrinsically different, much more horrible than just being shot. So there's a lot of emotion in the categorization of these systems as being war crime systems or non-war crime systems. So for instance, it's all right to have a machine gun and to shoot 100 people down with a belt of ammunition, But it's not all right to open the cylinder of a green cylinder of chlorine, a yellow cylinder of chlorine, and allow the chlorine gas to roll across the land between you and the other men, and then go into the trenches. So in other words, the people can't hide anymore. From the machine guns, they can sit in the trenches, the bullets go over their head, nothing happens. But the chlorine gas goes into the trenches and it kills them all. But essentially it's just a weapon of war, and it kills a certain number of people. This is not like radioactivity. This is not like the weapons like the results of using nuclear weapons. Because we can then fast forward to the use of nuclear weapons in atmospheric testing, which I would consider to be a war crime. So in atmospheric nuclear testing, these weapons, instead of producing a gas which went into the trenches of the people who were fighting you, this produces invisible nuclear particles that float all around the globe and cause massive increases in cancer, changes in the genetic structure of human beings, the genetic structure of animals, cause mutation, causes a reduction in sperm count, reduces the number of viable fetuses, so you get miscarriages, is the beginnings of what I was talking about planeticide. So all of these early methods of killing people in large numbers, for instance, well, barbed wire, dynamite, high explosive, chlorine gas, phosgene, sarin, and so on, they had indiscriminate effect on soldiers, so you couldn't hide from them. So I think that was one of the reasons why people said that these were wrong and that they were outlawed. So if we fast forward to the more recent wars in Iraq and the Middle East, where people have started to use, where the Allies, the British and the Americans have started to use uranium weapons, these uranium weapons are now what Marian Kupka, my colleague in Hamburg, has called the Trojan horse of nuclear war. So in other words, it's the use of a radioactive weapon, a weapon which causes genetic damage in the populations, the non-combatant populations, that is, of the Middle East. And work that I've done in Fallujah shows that the increases in cancer and congenital malformations there are immense. So these substances are beginning to cause the kind of planeticide effect that I was talking about earlier. So let us now talk about whether or not we can criminalise this and how we would do it. And this is much more difficult, but we need to try and engage with this problem. We need to start to think about how it might be possible to criminalise the systems. Now, my own belief is you cannot criminalise a system without criminalising the people in the system. For example, if you say that it is a war crime to indiscriminately kill civilians, then you have to find the people who do, and although it's a system, it's, if you like, a social structure that has made it possible to kill a lot of individuals, you have to find the people who have produced that social structure and sanction those people. You cannot sanction the structure. You cannot say we are going to criminalise terrorism, for example.
Yeah, but maybe other people know how to do it. You don't.
Well, I'm saying that we can certainly ask people what they think about this, but I mean, you have asked me to give my ideas on this, and that's what I'm doing.
Yeah, but
okay. So I don't want to have an argument about it.
Nevertheless, you said it's your belief.
Well,
but scientifically, there are ways of criminalizing systems.
If you say so.
We just have to find them.
If you say so. I mean, for example, do we criminalise the firebombing of cities? In which case, if we do criminalise the firebombing of cities like Dresden and Hamburg, and this is nothing to do with radiation now, but this is the wiping out of an entire city by a systematic and scientifically designed method to deprive the city of oxygen. Okay? And they knew that was what they were doing. And it was a terror weapon. The idea was we're going to destroy two cities, and the Germans will then put their hands up. Okay, and say, we give up. It didn't happen, of course, but that was the idea. But so can we say that that was a criminal action? Well, we can. I think we can. We can say that that was a war crime. But nobody has suffered as a result of it. And if it were me, I would take the people who designed that system and I would put them in a court. And I would investigate the extent to which they knew what they were doing, and then decide, and they advised the government to go ahead with it. And then I would put them in jail if we found them guilty. Or maybe not jail. Maybe not jail. Because this is what I say about the criminalisation of systems. Is that what you have to do is you have to withdraw from the system its identity in the world of human affairs.
Exactly.
Because, can I finish now? I mean, you can cheer if you like and clap. But to my mind, if you send somebody to jail for murder, you have to ask yourself what it is you're doing. In what sense are you sanctioning that person? Because jail nowadays is not a big deal. I mean, nobody pulls your fingernails out. It's not like after the Inquisition they don't put you in a dungeon and let you sort of starve to death. Nowadays it's not a bad place to be, jail. I mean, it's not great.
It's better than reality sometimes.
Yes, exactly. For many people it's better than reality. In fact, I did think myself that if it came to it, I would rather be in jail than living on the street in a cardboard box.
Exactly.
So at that point you knock a policeman's helmet off, and go to jail. This would be the logical way of behaving, So what it is that are you doing? Because nobody wants to go to jail, of course. And the reason is that the reason they don't want to go to jail, because I mean I think differently from different people, but most people don't want to go to jail because it removes from them their identity. The most important thing that a human being has is their identity, and the people in charge of these large organisations, and indeed the organisations themselves, are dependent upon their identity for their self-belief. So all of the people in an organisation, all of the people in Monsanto, all of the people in the nuclear industry, all of the people in various organisations that at the moment I would be considered to be immoral criminals, or the organisations to be immoral and criminal organisations, they don't think that they're immoral criminal, but they think they're great. They think that they're saving the free world, or they're creating the new generation of weapons because they're so clever. Or they're controlling nature because we're all frightened of nature, or they're preventing the women from taking over, or whatever it happens to be. They all have an identity associated with that structure. So what you have to do is to make that structure illegal. And you can do that. You can do that by stripping it of any advertising or creative representation of itself. So, for example, you could fine anybody in the media.
There we go, some procedures, yeah?
You could say that once you criminalise the system, let's say we're going to criminalise the organisations that produce genetically modified foods, because we know scientifically that those foods cause tremendous effects by gene exchange on living systems. Let's say we do that, just as an example. Then what we can do is we can say that, for instance, the company Monsanto we have criminalised, because they're the main company creating these genetically modified foods. And then what we do is we say that it is a criminal offence to be a member of this organisation, and if you are a member of this organisation, your identity is removed from you. So in other words, you're not allowed to be, you're not allowed to have anything written about you, you're not allowed to have any television programs made about you, you're not allowed to be interviewed by anybody, you're effectively extracted from the human race. You're extracted from the human race in terms of communication. And people in the street will not talk to you, and people in the street will not mention the name Monsanto.
Oh, you don't exaggerate.
Because if they do, they then become part of this system of exclusion.
At least they couldn't have impact on masses.
Well, that's also true. But
that's
actually,
the main.
That is also true, but that's not my point. I mean, that of course. That is the goal. Yeah. But the most important thing, as far as they're concerned, would be their loss of identity. The fact that no longer can anyone say Mr. Jones or Monsanto or the head of Monsanto or the deputy director of research at Monsanto. These people become non-people. They don't exist.
Nevertheless, it wouldn't make them non-people, would it?
Well, of course it would. Of course it would. In the modern age, the whole of society, the whole of the structure of the entire Earth.
Okay, let's not make this into emotional discussion.
Well, I'm talking, okay? Do you want me to just walk off?
Please don't. Please don't.
Well, I don't want to argue with you.
No, I'm not arguing. I'm just adding another opinion.
Oh.
You don't have to address it.
I haven't finished.
Yeah, but we have little time.
I'm talking about a media blackout, that's all.
Yeah, and I was just thinking that we don't need to. These people will get food anyway. They will get shelter.
Yeah, we don't have a problem with
and
that.
they don't have to go to jail. They can have reasonable conditions, even wealthy maybe, but not in the realms of power.
That's right.
That is not
in the realms
so
of power. So
they don't make impact on people, murderous impact, and genocide, and inquisition.
Not in the realms of media. That's the main thing, okay? Because now
and communication.
People's identity is associated with their position, and their position is associated with lots of people knowing that they're in that position. And if nobody can know that they're in that position, then they don't exist. And that's it, finished. So, I mean, I'm not saying that's the only way forward, but having thought about it, and having talked to Mahathir about what he said that he wanted to do, is that if you find somebody, an individual in this case, guilty, and in this case Tony Blair and George W. Bush, you actually use the media. So what you do there is you say you ask the media to always append the statement war criminal to the end of the person's name when anybody says anything about him on the media. But my approach is the opposite, is to actually sanction the media for even mentioning the person's name. So in other words, these people disappear completely. They're not allowed to be mentioned in the newspapers, and if anybody mentions them in the newspapers, then that person, that individual, then disappears.
Anyway, now you're talking about very sort of exact details in the method that could be preferable, but the details will be talked about later.
Anyway, I have one last word, okay, and that is planeticide. So just remember that word, okay, because that's what we're talking about, planeticide. Well, it's not there. Anyway, so that's it. So
what about these procedures?
No, all this stuff says is that laws are made by societies. That's all it says, basically. It says that laws are not universal, and what I'm saying is that isn't true. There are universal bases for laws, so long as the laws are big enough, and they have to do as you would be done by concept of account. So these are real. These are real laws which do not rely upon the creation of a social order. The only reason for a creation of a social order is to actually create laws, and then you can have sanctions, and we've talked about that. But what this is saying is that society develops an apparatus of law creation. We know all that stuff. That's all true. That's all true. But there is a sort of law creation system which is built into every individual, based on the concepts of Kant, the concepts of rules, and lots of other people. Probably the Greeks had it as well. I don't know. I can't remember. I used to read all this stuff. But we don't need to. We can go to Charles Kingsley and the Water Babies. That's all we need. Because we know that that's true. We know that that's true in our own hearts. That you do not want somebody to behave towards you in the way that you would. You do not behave towards somebody else in the way that you would not want them to behave towards you. And then therefore, of course, you certainly don't want somebody blowing up the whole world and killing everybody on Earth with a nuclear weapon. And therefore you create a law to stop them doing it. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you.
This is sort of one-man conference, isn't it? Really, two-man.
So the point here is really that
Kant, he was quite recently, it was 16th century, yeah? 17th century, and but these basic common laws, they have existed for thousands of years.
Well, he just identified that this is the basis of human morality, because you have to ask yourself why human beings don't just kill at each other all the time. That's a good question, okay?
Yeah.
And that's the answer.
I'll just wrap it up now. And really, what I'm trying to do here is to bring it to the base of a common law, without any philosophers, because there are these higher laws that we sort of address that are de facto existing on this planet and maybe in the whole universe. And that is one of the basic rules. Do the same to others that you would like to get done to yourself. And you don't even have to know any language somehow to know that rule. It doesn't have even to be taught to you. You can see that sort of, even people, it is quite generally basic rule. And I'm trying to get it tied to this indigenous tradition and to the laws of ancient predecessors, which I will find for the next session. Thank you very much.